welcome to the deep dive. Today, you've handed us some really fascinating material. C.G. Jung's Psychology and Religion.
Indeed. It's quite a profound work.
Yeah, we're going to dive into his unique take on spirituality, the power of the unconscious, and these surprising links between old symbols and, well, us, modern life.
Right.
So our mission for this deep dive, let's try to unpack Jung's ideas, maybe uncover some of those hidden forces he talks about, and figure out why he thought healing often involves engaging with, what did he call it? The numinous.
The numinous, yes.
Yeah.
We're stepping right into his world. And he's not just theorizing, he's observing religion as this living psychological thing.
Okay.
And what's really central, I think, is his insistence on looking at it empirically.
Empirically. How does that work with religion?
Well, he focuses on the existence of religious phenomena, within the psyche. He sort of sidesteps the whole debate about whether it's true in a metaphysical sense.
So it's about what's happening inside us.
Exactly. And not just what's taught externally, what we actually experience.
Okay. Jung's empirical view. It's interesting. But when most people hear religion, they think of specific faiths, churches, dogmas.
Right.
So how does he observe it empirically if it's not tied to a specific confession? What exactly is this numinosum he mentions? How does that change things?
Well, building on that, Jung doesn't see religion just as dogma. He calls it an attitude of the human spirit.
An attitude?
Yeah, like a careful, conscious way of dealing with these powerful, dynamic forces. Things like spirits, gods, even strong ideals. Things that really affect us.
Okay.
And he argues that every formal religion, deep down, is founded on that raw, immediate experience, the numinous.
That feeling, that power.
Exactly. And because he's an empiricist, he treats these religious experiences as psychological facts, just things that happen.
Like data?
Sort of. He has that famous quote, doesn't he? An elephant is true because it exists.
Ah, yes.
The elephant is not a logical conclusion, it is simply a phenomenon. And he applies that same thinking to psychic events. They exist, therefore they are true psychological facts worth observing.
That comparison, the elephant and a psychic event, that's really striking. It really shifts how you think about psychology, doesn't it?
It does.
Treating our inner life, feelings, dreams with that same empirical weight as, well, an elephant. What does that mean for us?
Well, it leads him straight into his ideas about neuroses.
Okay.
Jung found that many neuroses actually have what he called a religious conditioning. He really stressed that psychology and theology should work together. He even observed physical illnesses like a hysterical fever or severe psoriasis.
Multiple things.
Yeah, that could sometimes be cured incredibly quickly, like in minutes or weeks, just by tackling the psychological cause through confession or just talking it through.
Wow.
And that directly challenges the common idea, the materialistic view, that our psyche is just some secondary byproduct of the brain.
Right. Just neurons firing.
For Jung, the psyche was absolutely real. He said, the only form of existence of which we have immediate knowledge is the psychic.
That's a strong statement.
It is. And he even warned that mental disorders are more dangerous than epidemics and earthquakes.
Okay, hold on. That idea, an imaginary illness being more dangerous than a physical one.
Yeah.
That's pretty radical. It goes against almost everything we assume about health.
It is radical.
Can you walk us through one of his cases, something that really shows this?
Absolutely. There's a famous case of a patient suffering from an imaginary carcinoma.
Imaginary. So not physically real.
No, the patient knew it wasn't physically real, but Jung called it a mortal illness of his soul, something that was actively poisoning his relationships, his life.
So how did Jung interpret that if it wasn't physical?
He didn't just dismiss it as a delusion. He saw it as this spontaneous thing growing out of a part of the psyche that wasn't conscious, an independent formation.
Independent.
Yeah, he called these things autonomous intruders or complexes. Like they behave almost like secondary personalities with their own kind of life. So instead of saying snap out of it, Jung told the patient to take it very, very seriously, to see it as an actual autonomous power working against his conscious self.
And why did Jung think this happened to this patient?
Well, this patient was apparently a highly intellectual type who, in Jung's view, abused reason and intellect for selfish ends. So the carcinoma, this imaginary illness, was like the unconscious getting its revenge, trying to shatter his belief that his willpower, his intellect was all powerful.
That is quite a diagnosis. It really makes you think, doesn't it? About how our unconscious might be trying to, communicate.
Definitely.
We tend to think we're in charge of our minds, but Jung's saying there's this other powerful side. He mentions that most people have a kind of Deisteudaimonia about the unconscious. Can you unpack that word?
Deisteudaimonia, yeah, it's more than just fear. It's like a superstitious awe or dread, a secret fear of what might be lurking down there.
And Jung thought this fear was justified.
Absolutely. He says it's well justified because, he warns, while these forces usually lie dormant in us as individuals,
When people get together in large groups, things can change. They can become a disorderly mob, unleashing these deep collective dynamisms, the beasts and demons that slumber inside everyone.
so it's a mistake to think our psyche is just purely personal.
A fatal mistake, he called it. It's like we always live as if on top of a volcano. We're mostly unaware of the huge power just beneath the surface.
Living on a volcano. That's a vivid image. It makes you wonder how much of our everyday angst might be these deeper things trying to surface.
It does.
And Jung saw dreams as absolutely crucial for understanding this hidden side, right? He talks about ancient peoples, like that tribe on Mount Elgon.
Yes, who saw dreams as the voice of Mungu, the numinous god, and treated them very carefully.
Whereas we tend to dismiss them.
We often do. Jung even quotes Benedictus Perarius back in the 16th century, who classified dreams: natural, human, divine, even diabolical.
Diabolical dreams, seriously. Well, according to Perarius, he had criteria for a divine dream, too. Like, it revealed knowledge you couldn't get otherwise, touched on deep mysteries, and brought this inner conviction.
And the diabolical ones?
They might reveal hidden things, too, but Perarius thought it was just for showing off or to lead someone towards evil.
So how did people tell the difference?
Perarius mentioned that saints relied on an interior affective feeling, a kind of gut instinct about the dream source. It raises a big question for us today, doesn't it? How do we discern?
Definitely. So Jung never looked at just one dream in isolation. He saw them as links in a chain, right?
Exactly. Visible links in a chain of unconscious processes.
Yeah.
You need the series to see the pattern.
Okay, so let's follow that chain for this patient, the one with the imaginary carcinoma. He had hundreds of dreams, over 400 apparently.
An incredible amount.
Let's dive into one of the early ones, the one set in that strange theater-like house.
Right. This one starts with the line, every house has something that reminds one of a stage, something of a theater.
Intriguing start.
And there's a sign. This is the Universal Catholic Church. It is the Church of the Lord. All who feel themselves to be instruments of the Lord may enter. But then underneath it says, the church was founded by Jesus and Paul.
Okay, a mix of messages there, universal but specific founders.
And inside, it looks like a mosque. Specifically, Hagia Sophia. No pews, no images, just framed sayings like, do not flatter your benefactors.
Wow, a real mashup of symbols.
Yeah.
Catholic, Islamic, theater, what's going on there?
And then it gets even stranger. The patient's Protestant friend appears in the dream and can't understand why so many people need to gather for religious feelings. And right after that, a woman cries out, then there is nothing left, and vanishes.
Okay, who is this woman? And why does she say that?
Jung identifies her as the anima.
Ah, the anima, that's his term for
the unconscious feminine side in a man, yes. And she often represents parts of the unconscious that are, let's say, less convenient, unpleasant and irritating, Jung calls them, aspects we try to exclude from our conscious life. So her negative reaction, crying out like that, it signals that the patient's deeper feminine side isn't buying this setup, this superficial compromise the dream presents between Catholicism and this sort of paix joie de vivre.
Paix joie de vivre.
Yeah, the priest in the dream even admits to second-rate amusements and an anti-ascetic orientation. Jung basically sees it as a kind of empty, sacrilegious paganism trying to pass itself off as spiritual.
So the anima is calling it out, saying there's nothing substantial
The
there.
dream is showing this core conflict. The patient, who consciously thought he wasn't religious, was actually using this idea of religion to dodge his real emotional needs.
Like what sort of needs?
Well, what Jung calls the other side of the soul's life. Things like connection, marriage, love, emotional dependency. The stuff his intellectual persona tried to dismiss.
So that first dream was really reflecting his inner state. But you mentioned earlier, Jung thought it might also be a distraction.
Yes. Jung suggests this whole church dream, while revealing, was also partly an attempt by the patient's psyche to avoid facing other, deeper, maybe more terrible dreams he was having around the same time.
Terrible dreams. What were they about?
Well, the dream right before the church one involved a ceremony to reconstruct the gibbon.
Reconstruct a gibbon, like the ape.
Yes. Jung interprets this as representing the patient's neglected instinctive personality. the primate within, if you like.
Okay.
And then the dream after the church one talked about the transformation of animals into human beings. It continues the theme. The monkey, the instinctual self, needs to be transformed, integrated.
So it's pointing towards a need for fundamental change.
Absolutely. Reintegrating this divided off instinctual life to become a new man. And Jung makes this fascinating point that while we moderns might be scared by thoughts of our inner ape,
Yeah, probably.
people 2,000 years ago might have rejoiced immensely at dreams like that, seen them as signs of spiritual rebirth.
A totally different perspective. And then later, much later in the series, there was another really key dream. The House of Concentration.
Yes, a very significant one.
What did that one reveal about where the patient was heading?
In this dream, he enters a house of solemnity, a place of inner concentration. Inside, candles are arranged in 4 points upwards.
4 points, that number again.
Exactly. And an old man tells him, when you leave here, you will be purified.
Purified.
Then a powerful voice, something that apparently spoke in many of his dreams, declares, what you are doing is dangerous.
Dangerous, but he's being purified.
It seems paradoxical, but this voice, Jung says, was like a key representative of the unconscious, often showing more intelligence and purpose than the patient's conscious mind. It was like a direct, authoritative warning from his depths.
That's fascinating. So, okay, back to the 4 points. And you said the number 4 came up loads of times, 71 times in 400 dreams.
That's what Jung notes, yes. It's clearly not random.
So what's the deal with 4?
It points straight to this incredibly powerful archetype, the quaternity, the number 4.
Okay.
And Jung traces its history everywhere, Pythagoras thinking the soul was a square.
Really?
Yeah. Christian symbols like the 4 evangelists, Gnostic philosophy, and especially alchemy.
Alchemy, with the philosopher's stone.
Exactly. The whole squaring of the circle idea, the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, water, they were all central to creating the stone. And the stone itself was often symbolized as like a complete being, sometimes hermaphroditic or called the second Adam, the perfected human, the Homo philosophicus.
So 4 represents completion, totality.
That seems to be the core idea, totality, wholeness.
Which makes you think, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it sounds like this quaternity, this 4-ness, suggests a kind of completeness that maybe the Christian Trinity, being 3, doesn't quite capture.
That's precisely Jung's observation. The Orthodox Trinity, the 3, seems to lack a formal place for, well, the principle of evil.
Right, the devil exists separately.
Exactly, leads a separate existence. Jung notes some Catholic thinkers even said Satan's existence only makes sense against the backdrop of the Trinity. He has his own autonomy, freedom, even eternity. And Jung found this 16th century thinker, Dornius, who actually called the quaternity Diabolica Fraus, the devil's deception.
Right.
Because Dornius associated 4 with the feminine, with Mother Earth, which he felt was left out of the purely masculine trinity.
Wow.
So when this quaternity symbol pops up in modern dreams, Jung sees it hinting at something.
Right.
Maybe an inner God, maybe even an identity of God with man, which from a traditional standpoint could look like blasphemy or madness.
It's like the psyche is trying to integrate something that dogma leaves out.
That's very much Jung's perspective. It's striving for a wholeness that includes the perceived dark or other elements.
So all these symbols, circles, squares, the number 4, where did it all lead for this patient? You mentioned a culminating vision, sublime harmony.
Yes, the mandala vision. It was incredibly powerful for the patient.
What was it like?
He described it as a vertical circle and a horizontal circle with a common center. It is the clock of the universe, carried by the blackbird.
The clock of the universe.
The vertical circle was blue, divided into 32 parts. The horizontal one was 4-colored. Now, typically, historical mandalas, like Buddhist ones, have a deity in the center.
Right.
But this patient's mandala, it had an empty center.
Empty. Why is that significant?
For Jung, it's crucial. It suggests that the place of the divinity is occupied by the totality of man.
The totality of man.
What Jung calls the self with a capital S. The whole thing, conscious and unconscious combined.
So the divine isn't out there anymore.
In modern psychology, Jung posits that divine image is often no longer projected onto an external God. It's become internalized, imprisoned, hidden, protected, represented by an abstract symbol within us.
Which is why the center is empty but structured, like a clock symbolizing time.
Exactly. It contrasts with older beliefs. It's like Jung says, even the God-man himself descends from his throne to dissolve himself into the common man. The divine potential is now located within the individual human psyche.
That raises that big question again, the Nietzschean one. If God dies or dissolves into us, what happens? Isn't that dangerous?
It is potentially dangerous. Jung warns that when that happens, individuals can fall victim to inflation.
Inflation.
Yeah, where the small ego identifies with this huge internalized divine power, basically thinking you are God. He saw that as Nietzsche's personal tragedy.
Okay.
For Jung, God, psychologically speaking, represents the strongest, most organizing point in the psyche. We're always choosing our master, consciously or not.
So how do we handle this internalized power without getting inflated?
That's where the mandala comes back in.
Yeah.
With its circles, its squares, its boundaries, it acts as a protective wall. Or like a vas hermeticum, that's an alchemical term for a sealed vessel.
A container.
Right. It helps create a contained space within the psyche to hold and integrate this immense energy, to concentrate around the self without the ego being overwhelmed or dissolved.
So it's not just a pretty picture. It's like a psychological blueprint for balance.
Yeah.
For holding these huge opposing forces together.
That's a great way to put it, a blueprint for balance.
Almost like the unconscious providing a map for becoming whole.
Indeed. That clock of the universe vision, Jung felt, was the patient's first indication of a possible solution to that huge conflict. You know, matter versus spirit, worldly desires versus love of God.
Right.
It went way beyond that poor and ineffective compromise in the earlier church dream. This was pointing towards a real union of the soul with God, but happening within.
And you mentioned alchemy again.
Yes, Jung draws strong parallels. The philosopher's stone in alchemy was also seen as a symbol of this inner God, this indestructible core found within, often called a hidden nature or spirit.
Like that saying, everything outside is also inside.
Exactly. Everything that is outside of us, there is also inside of us. And reconciling these opposites, including integrating the shadow,
The shadow being.
our primitive side, the inferior bits, the stuff we don't like about ourselves. Not necessarily evil, just undeveloped or rejected. Integrating that is key to the whole healing process.
Jung's actual therapeutic approach seems so practical in a way. Not imposing beliefs, working with whatever the patient brought, whether it was science or religion.
As long as it was working for them, yes. But if their dreams started to challenge that defense.
Then he'd side with the dreams, with the broader personality emerging.
Exactly. He'd side with the unconscious trying to break through.
How did this work for people maybe from a Protestant background? Jung mentions them specifically.
Well, he saw the Protestant as having, in a sense, lost the protection of the walls of the church.
More exposed.
Yes, left helpless before God without the mediating structure of the church community and rituals. This could lead to a bad conscience, a sense of anxiety or guilt, but also, crucially, a unique spiritual possibility of immediate religious experience, a direct encounter.
Because the walls are down.
Precisely. And Jung firmly believed that what cures neurosis must be as convincing as the neurosis itself. Meaning neurosis feels incredibly real, powerful. So the cure, the healing experience, has to have that same level of reality, that same conviction. It can't just be an intellectual idea.
And it has to hit you with the same force. So for Jung, that direct personal religious experience is something absolute. You can't argue with it.
Exactly. There is no room for discussion about it. When it happens, it becomes a source of life, meaning beauty. It's self-validating.
An undeniable inner truth.
Yes. And he talks about the spiritual adventure of our time being the surrender, this letting go of conscious control, opening up to the indeterminate and indeterminable forces within us.
Which sounds scary, but he says it's governed by laws.
Governed by those laws of the soul that man has not imagined. There's an inherent order, this deep knowledge, which he sometimes calls no-solusis. It's not just thinking, it's experiencing these inner laws.
And that's where the symbols come in.
Right, found in religious dogma, in ancient myths, and amazingly, spontaneously showing up in modern dreams. Like those mandalas.
Even if the person has no idea about the history of mandala.
Often, yes. Which for Jung points to something inherited, something built in, and inherited a priori in the psyche.
The archetype.
The archetype, these universal patterns of meaning bubbling up from the collective unconscious.
And that's our deep dive into C.G. Jung's psychology and religion. Wow, what an incredible journey that was. To the psyche, into symbols, into wholeness.
It really covers so much ground.
That we've seen how Jung really dared to treat the imaginary as real. How dreams can be these powerful guides, and how symbols like the quaternity, the mandala, they still speak to our deepest conflicts today. That search for reconciliation.
It certainly raises a big question, I think, for you listening. If the psyche is like this vast ocean, maybe with that empty center Jung described, ready to be filled by the totality of the self, what sacred fire, what energy might be stirring in your own depths right now, waiting to be noticed, acknowledged, maybe integrated into a fuller life?
That's quite a thought. Challenging,
It'd
definitely.
be a little challenging, yeah. But perhaps also incredibly liberating.
It certainly could be. And if Jung is right, that what cures neurosis has to be as convincing as the neurosis itself, well, then maybe taking your own inner experience seriously, truly seriously, is the most real thing you can possibly do.
A powerful thought to end on.
It is. Until next time, keep exploring the depths within.